Judge Maxwell Whitaker smirks as he slams his gavel down, imposing an outrageous $1,000 fine on 76-year-old Eleanor Washington for contempt of court. The courtroom falls silent as Eleanor slowly rises, her voice unwavering. "Your Honor, you've just violated Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Before we dive into this shocking courtroom confrontation, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. If this judge's behavior already has your blood boiling, hit that like button and subscribe to see how this elderly woman turns the tables on a judge who picked the wrong person to underestimate." The Jefferson County Courthouse had seen its fair share of drama over its 100-year history, but nothing quite like what unfolded on that sweltering Tuesday morning in July. The air conditioning struggled against the summer heat, making the wood-paneled courtroom feel more like a pressure cooker than a hall of justice. Eleanor Washington sat in the third row, her silver-framed glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed some notes. At 76, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that comes from decades of commanding respect in lecture halls and courtrooms. Today, however, she wasn't here in any official capacity. She was simply a grandmother, accompanying her 24-year-old grandson Marcus to his hearing for a minor traffic violation. Eleanor had noticed something troubling as she observed the morning's proceedings. Judge Richard Maxwell Whitaker, a 62-year-old white man with thinning silver hair and perpetually pursed lips, seemed to operate two entirely different courtrooms depending on who stood before him. When Brian Collins, a young white man with an expensive haircut and designer clothes, approached for speeding 20 miles over the limit, Judge Whitaker was practically jovial. "We all get a lead foot sometimes, son," the judge had said with a chuckle. "Pay attention to those speed limit signs next time." He reduced the fine and sent Collins on his way with a warning. Just minutes later, Jamal Thompson, a black college student with the same violation, received a maximum fine and a stern lecture about responsibility and respect for the law. The pattern continued throughout the morning: leniency for white defendants, harshness for people of color. Eleanor's lips tightened as she watched, her legal mind cataloging each discrepancy. After 45 years teaching law, such inequities still made her blood pressure rise. But she remained silent, knowing her grandson's case would be called soon. "Marcus Washington," the clerk finally announced. Marcus, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and tie at his grandmother's insistence, approached the bench confidently. At 6'2", he was an imposing figure, but his demeanor was respectful as he addressed the court. "Good morning, Your Honor," he began. Judge Whitaker barely glanced up from his papers. "You were caught running a stop sign on Elmwood Avenue. How do you plead?" "If I may explain, Your Honor," Marcus started. "The stop sign is partially obscured by an overgrown tree. I did slow down but didn't see. I didn't ask for a story," Judge Whitaker interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp. "Guilty or not guilty?" Eleanor could see her grandson's shoulders tense. She knew that tree on Elmwood well. There had been complaints about it for months. Marcus had a valid defense. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Marcus said firmly. "As I was trying to explain, the municipal code requires all traffic signage to be clearly visible from 100 feet. That particular sign—" "Young man," Whitaker cut in again, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you trying to lecture me on traffic laws?" Marcus took a deep breath. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply stating my defense as is my right." From her seat, Eleanor could see the judge's face hardening. She recognized the look. She'd seen it on too many white men in positions of power when they felt challenged by a black person who knew their rights. She quietly gathered her purse and moved to the front row. Marcus continued. "According to Section 7.3 of the Municipal Code—" "That's enough," Whitaker snapped. "The court doesn't appreciate your attitude." Eleanor couldn't stay silent any longer. She leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for her grandson to hear. "Cite the visibility statute and request the maintenance records for that intersection." Judge Whitaker's head snapped up, his cold eyes finding Eleanor. "Who said that? Did someone just try to coach this defendant?" The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor met the judge's gaze calmly. "Ma'am, did you just attempt to advise this defendant?" Whitaker demanded. Eleanor stood, her posture perfect despite her years. I was simply reminding my grandson of his legal rights, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker's face flushed red. This is my courtroom, ma'am. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not offer legal advice. You do not interrupt these proceedings. With all due respect, Your Honor, Eleanor replied, evenly. As an observer in a public courtroom, I'm well within my rights to quietly advise my grandson. The judge's eyes narrowed dangerously. You clearly don't understand how a courtroom functions. What's your name? Eleanor Washington, Your Honor. Well, Mrs. Washington, he said, emphasizing the Mrs. with a dismissive tone. I find you in contempt of court. This kind of behavior undermines our entire justice system. Eleanor didn't flinch. I believe you're overstepping your authority, Your Honor. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Nobody spoke to Judge Whitaker like that. Excuse me? He sputtered, his face growing redder. You come into my courtroom and have the audacity to question my authority? That's another count of contempt. I'm fining you $1,000. The judge banged his gavel with finality, clearly expecting Eleanor to crumble in the face of his authority. Several court officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Instead, Eleanor adjusted her glasses calmly. Your Honor, I should inform you that you've just violated Federal Statute 18 U.S.C., Section 242, which prohibits the deprivation of rights under color of law. Your pattern of discriminatory treatment in this courtroom, which I've been observing all morning, combined with your excessive and retaliatory contempt charge against me, constitutes a clear violation. Judge Whitaker's smug expression faltered. Who exactly do you think you are? Eleanor straightened to her full height. I am Professor Emeritus Eleanor Washington of Howard University School of Law, former special counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and author of Constitutional Boundaries in Judicial Discretion, which, ironically, is cited in the Judicial A's Conduct Handbook on your shelf. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Whitaker's face drained of color as the realization dawned on him that he had just dressed down one of the most respected constitutional law scholars in the country. This hearing is in recess, he stammered, banging his gavel before practically fleeing the bench. As the judge disappeared through the door to his chambers, all eyes in the courtroom turned to Eleanor Washington, who stood unshaken, her gaze fixed on the empty judge's chair. The name Eleanor Washington carried weight in legal circles across America, though she had never sought the spotlight. Her journey to becoming one of the most respected legal minds in the country began in 1968 when she was admitted to Harvard Law School as one of only 3 black women in her class. Born to school teachers in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, Eleanor had grown up watching her parents fight for civil rights. Her father had marched with Dr. King. Her mother had taught literacy classes to help black voters overcome discriminatory voting tests. The law, Eleanor decided early on, would be her battlefield. Harvard in the late 60s was hardly welcoming to someone like her. On her first day, a professor asked her to justify her presence when she had taken a spot from a qualified man who would actually practice law. Another student asked if she was lost when she entered the law library. A third assumed she was part of the cleaning staff. They expected me to quit within a semester, Eleanor once told an interviewer. Their expectation became my motivation. She graduated 3rd in her class in 1972, having served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Even with those credentials, no major law firm would hire her. Instead, she joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she worked on groundbreaking civil rights cases throughout the 70s. One of her earliest victories came in defending a black business owner in Mississippi, whose property had been seized through discriminatory application of tax laws. The case established a precedent that required equal enforcement of tax codes, regardless of race, a ruling still cited today. In 1981, Eleanor joined the faculty at Howard University School of Law, where she would teach for the next 45 years. Her constitutional law classes became legendary, with students sometimes sitting in the aisles just to hear her lectures. 3 current Supreme Court justices had studied under her. 12 federal judges counted her as a mentor. Her former students held positions in every branch of government. Professor Washington doesn't just teach the law, one former student, now a federal prosecutor, said in a tribute video for her retirement. She reveals its soul, its capacity for both tremendous harm and tremendous good, depending on whose hands wield it. Eleanor's scholarly work proved equally influential. Her textbook on constitutional interpretation had been through 17 editions and was used in law schools nationwide. Her paper on judicial discretion in sentencing had been cited in 3 Supreme Court decisions. When she spoke at legal conferences, even the most accomplished attorneys fell silent to listen. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded to her by President Obama in 2016, was just one of many honors she had received over her distinguished career. The citation praised her for expanding our nation's understanding of justice and equality under law. Despite these accolades, Eleanor remained humble and focused on practical impact. After her official retirement, she continued to write amicus briefs for important cases and volunteered at legal clinics serving low-income communities. She made a habit of observing court proceedings in different jurisdictions, documenting patterns of bias and advocating for reforms. "The law isn't just in leather-bound books or marble courthouses," she often told her students. "It's in that traffic court where a single mother might lose her license and therefore her job. It's in that housing court where a family might face eviction because they complained about unsafe conditions. Justice isn't abstract, it's intensely personal." This philosophy explained why, despite her status, Eleanor had chosen to sit in a routine traffic court that Tuesday morning. She had been tracking Judge Whitaker's rulings for months, troubled by what she saw as a clear pattern of racial bias. Several complaints had been filed against him, but the Judicial Review Board, composed largely of his social peers, had dismissed them all. Eleanor had been methodically gathering evidence, recording dates, rulings, and disparities in sentencing. She had interviewed former defendants and compiled statistics. The pattern was unmistakable. Black defendants in Whitaker's courtroom received fines averaging 70% higher than white defendants for identical offenses. They were denied continuances at 3 times the rate. Their testimony was interrupted twice as often. What Eleanor hadn't planned was becoming part of the story herself. She had intended to compile her evidence and present a formal complaint through proper channels. But watching the judge's dismissive treatment of her grandson, and then his retaliatory fine against her, had forced her hand. As Eleanor sat in the courthouse cafeteria during the unexpected recess, her phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues and students who had somehow already heard about the confrontation. Word traveled fast in legal circles, and by noon, the story of how Professor Washington had stood up to the notoriously difficult Judge Whitaker was spreading through law schools and courthouses across the state. "Professor Washington," a young court clerk approached her table nervously. "I just wanted to say I've read all your work on judicial ethics. What happened in there today? It wasn't right." Eleanor smiled gently at the young woman. "Thank you, dear. The law is only as good as those who apply it." "They're saying the judge wants to drop the contempt charge," the clerk whispered. "He's been on the phone with the chief judge for the past hour." Eleanor sipped her tea calmly. That would be prudent, but insufficient. This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern that has affected hundreds of defendants who didn't have the privilege of my credentials to protect them. As she spoke, Eleanor caught sight of her grandson approaching with 2 cups of coffee. His face showed concern mingled with pride. "Grandma, are you sure you want to take this on?" Marcus asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "You know how vindictive Whitaker can be. He has powerful friends." Eleanor reached across the table and patted his hand. "I've faced worse, child. Much worse. And I didn't spend my life teaching others to stand up for justice just to look the other way when it's inconvenient." Her phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. Somehow the story had already reached the local media. The headline read, "Constitutional Law Expert Challenges Controversial Judge's Authority in Courtroom Showdown." Eleanor sighed. This was no longer just about documenting patterns of bias. It had become a direct confrontation with a system that too often protected its own at the expense of justice. At 76, she had hoped to spend her remaining years mentoring the next generation of advocates, not leading the charge herself. But sometimes, the moment chose you. "Court resumes in 15 minutes, the bailiff announced from the cafeteria doorway Eleanor Washington straightened her jacket, gathered her notes, and prepared to return to courtroom 3. Behind her perfect posture and calm expression, her mind was already strategizing the battles to come. Who exactly was Judge Richard Maxwell Whitaker, and how had he maintained his position of power despite years of questionable behavior? If you're wondering how such blatant discrimination could go unchallenged in our justice system, type "justice" in the comments. And if you believe judges should be held accountable regardless of their connections, hit that like button and subscribe to follow Eleanor's fight against this powerful adversary. Richard Maxwell Whitaker III had never wanted for anything in his life. Born to a prominent family whose name graced buildings throughout the city, his path to the bench had been paved with privilege and connections rather than exceptional legal talent. His grandfather had been a state senator, his father a wealthy corporate attorney who golfed regularly with governors and congressmen. Young Richard attended the finest private schools, where discipline problems were smoothed over with generous donations. His mediocre grades didn't prevent his acceptance to his father's Ivy League alma mater, where he was a legacy admission, and where a new library wing coincidentally broke ground the year he applied. After law school, where he graduated in the bottom third of his class, Whitaker joined his father's firm, specializing in defending corporations against discrimination lawsuits. His courtroom record was unremarkable, but his social calendar was impressive. Charity galas, political fundraisers, country club memberships that still quietly excluded minorities despite official policies to the contrary. When a judicial vacancy opened up 12 years ago, Whitaker's name rose to the top of the list not because of his legal acumen but because of who he knew. His appointment had been quietly opposed by the local bar association, which cited his limited trial experience and concerning temperament, but the governor, a former client of Whitaker's father, pushed it through nonetheless. From the beginning, there were red flags. In his first year on the bench, Whitaker's reversal rate on appeal was nearly twice the state average, particularly in cases involving minority defendants. When questioned about this pattern by the Judicial Review Committee, he dismissed it as statistical anomalies and reminded the committee chairman about their upcoming fishing trip. 3 years into his tenure, a hot microphone caught him referring to a black female attorney as another affirmative action special after she left his courtroom. When the recording surfaced, his office issued a statement claiming his words had been taken out of context and the matter was quietly dropped. The data told a damning story for anyone willing to look. A review of 5 years of his rulings showed that black defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Latino defendants were denied bail at 3 times the rate of white defendants with similar records. Asian American attorneys had their objections overruled twice as often as their white colleagues. Complaints accumulated in his file, over 30 in the past decade, but none resulted in disciplinary action. The Regional Judicial Conduct Board included his former law partner, his brother-in-law's college roommate, and 2 men who belonged to the same exclusive country club. Complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated or insufficient to establish bias with remarkable consistency. Court employees who witnessed his behavior daily walked a careful line. Those who questioned his rulings found their performance reviews suddenly declining. Those who played along were rewarded with favorable schedules and recommendations for advancement. James Robinson, a promising young black attorney who had filed a formal complaint about Whitaker's treatment of his clients 3 years earlier, found himself subjected to excessive scrutiny in every subsequent appearance in Whitaker's courtroom. Opposing counsel would receive favorable rulings without even having to argue their motions. Robinson eventually stopped taking cases that might appear before Whitaker, effectively limiting his practice and income. It's an open secret, one court reporter had confided to Eleanor when she began her investigation. Everyone knows what happens in Whitaker's courtroom, but nobody with enough power to do anything about it wants to rock the boat. The reporter had shown Eleanor the transcripts from dozens of cases, revealing stark differences in how Whitaker addressed defendants, based on their race. White defendants were sir and ma'am, afforded time to explain their circumstances. Black and brown defendants were cut short, lectured, and dismissed. Perhaps most disturbing were Whitaker's connections to local law enforcement. Officers, knew that certain types of cases would receive favorable treatment in his courtroom, creating a pipeline of discriminatory enforcement. Arrests in predominantly minority neighborhoods were fast-tracked to his docket, where harsh sentences awaited. Whitaker maintained a veneer of respectability through strategic philanthropy. Hefty donations to the symphony, the art museum, the children's hospital. His wife chaired charity galas. His Christmas card list included senators, university presidents, and corporate CEOs. When the rare criticism did surface, these connections formed a protective shield around him. Eleanor had attempted to address the issue through official channels before. 6 months earlier, she had submitted a detailed report to the State Judicial Ethics Committee, complete with statistical analysis and sworn statements from affected parties. The committee had thanked her for her citizen input and promised to review the matter. She later learned the report had been buried without investigation. Now, as the court prepared to reconvene after the unexpected recess, Eleanor knew she had forced the issue into the open. Whitaker could no longer hide behind closed-door reviews and private dismissals of complaints. His conduct would be examined in the harsh light of public scrutiny. In his chambers, Judge Whitaker was frantically making phone calls. To the chief judge, "She blindsided me, completely unprofessional." To his old fraternity brother on the Judicial Review Board, "You need to get ahead of this." To the district attorney, "Remind your prosecutors who signs their warrants." To his wife, "Cancel dinner with the Hendersons. We have a situation." What Judge Whitaker didn't know was that his habit of treating court staff like furniture, invisible, unless needed, meant that the court clerk, Sophia Martinez, could hear every word through the thin walls. And Sophia, who had watched Whitaker's discriminatory behavior for 5 years while advancing from file clerk to her current position, was taking notes. Sophia had seen defendants leave Whitaker's courtroom in tears after being berated for minor infractions. She had watched public defenders' arguments dismissed before they could finish their first sentence. She had compiled her own private record of the disparities, hoping someday someone would care enough to do something. As she listened to the judge scramble to activate his network of protection, Sophia made a decision. The transcripts and recordings that documented Whitaker's pattern of behavior would not be accidentally lost or altered, as had happened with previous complaints. Not this time. Eleanor Washington had no idea she had an ally behind the scenes. But as the bailiff called the court back to order, the wheels were already in motion for a confrontation that would extend far beyond one afternoon in traffic court. Do you think Judge Whitaker should be investigated for his pattern of discrimination? Comment investigate if you believe justice should be equal for everyone regardless of race. And if you're curious about what happens when Eleanor returns to face this powerful judge, subscribe now and hit that like button to see how this courthouse showdown continues. The courtroom hushed as Judge Whitaker re-entered, his usual confident stride replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable gait. His face remained flushed, but he had composed himself during the recess, clearly prepared to reassert control over his domain. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice straining for its usual authority. His eyes deliberately avoided Eleanor's direction as he shuffled papers on his bench. The gallery was notably fuller than before the recess. Word had spread through the courthouse, drawing curious attorneys, court staff, and even a few reporters, who had been covering other cases. All eyes darted between the judge and the distinguished elderly woman who had challenged him. "In the interest of moving today's docket along," Whitaker began, "I'm going to dismiss the contempt charge against Mrs. Washington and proceed with the scheduled cases." He emphasized Mrs. rather than Professor, a subtle but deliberate slight that did not go unnoticed by those familiar with academic protocol. Eleanor rose slowly from her seat. "Your Honor, I must respectfully decline your dismissal of the contempt charge." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Declining the dismissal of a charge against oneself was virtually unheard of. Judge Whitaker finally looked directly at Eleanor, bewilderment evident on his face. "You decline? Mrs. Washington, perhaps you don't understand. I'm dismissing the fine against you." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying clearly through the room without being raised. But dismissing this single incident allows the underlying pattern of discriminatory behavior to continue unchallenged. I insist that the record reflect both the contempt charge and the circumstances surrounding it." She opened a small notebook and began to speak with the precision of someone who had spent decades mastering the law. "This morning alone, in the 2 hours I've observed these proceedings, you've demonstrated a clear pattern of disparate treatment. The white defendant Brian Collins, charged with driving 23 miles over the speed limit, received a reduced fine and no points on his license. 15 minutes later, Jamal Thompson, with an identical violation, received the maximum fine and full points." Judge Whitaker's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Mrs. Washington, you will sit down immediately," Eleanor continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Maria Gonzalez requested a continuance due to a documented medical emergency. You denied it and entered a default judgment. 20 minutes later, Catherine Pierce requested a continuance because, in her words, this date isn't convenient, and you granted it without question." "Bailiff," Whitaker called, his voice rising, "escort Mrs. Washington out of my courtroom." The bailiff, a middle-aged black man named Officer Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably, but made no move toward Eleanor. "Your Honor," the bailiff said quietly, "perhaps we should—" "That was an order, not a suggestion," Whitaker snapped. Eleanor turned slightly to address the bailiff. "Officer Reynolds, I should inform you that forcibly removing a person from a public courtroom for merely reciting factual observations could potentially expose you to personal liability under Section 1983 of the U.S. Code." Officer Reynolds remained rooted in place, looking uncertainly between the judge and the law professor. By now, several people in the courtroom had discreetly taken out their phones, recording the unprecedented confrontation despite the court's rules against electronic devices. No one moved to stop them. Eleanor turned back to the judge. "I have documented 17 instances this morning alone of disparate treatment based on race. This follows a pattern I've observed over 6 previous visits to your courtroom, during which I recorded 123 similar incidents." "This is outrageous," Whitaker sputtered. "You've been spying on my court?" "Observing," Eleanor corrected calmly, "as is my right as a citizen in a public proceeding. I've been compiling data for a report on judicial conduct across the district. Your courtroom, Judge Whitaker, shows the most significant statistical deviation in treatment of minorities of any I've observed." Marcus stood up beside his grandmother. "Your Honor, I'd like to add that when I entered this courtroom today, I was not expecting preferential treatment, but I also wasn't expecting to be treated with less dignity than white defendants with identical charges." Judge Whitaker's face contorted with rage. "This is a coordinated attempt to undermine the authority of this court. I will have order." He banged his gavel so hard that the head cracked, a piece of wood skittering across the polished surface of the bench. The symbolism was lost on no one. "I am ordering this courtroom cleared," Whitaker shouted. "Everyone out. Court is in recess until tomorrow morning." No one moved. The unprecedented standoff held the room in its grip. From her desk to the right of the bench, Sophia Martinez, the court clerk, stood up. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor, as court clerk, I am required by law to ensure that all proceedings are properly recorded and preserved." She held up a small thumb drive. "I've just backed up today's audio recording and saved it to a secure location, as is standard procedure." This was a lie. There was no such standard procedure. But Sophia had made the backup during the recess, knowing that recordings had a way of disappearing when they contained content that might embarrass Judge Whitaker. The judge stared at her in disbelief. This was a second betrayal, from a staff member he had assumed was loyally under his control. "Ms. Martinez," he said through clenched teeth, "you will surrender that device immediately." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Your Honor," Sophia replied. "Court records are public documents. Attempting to destroy or alter them would violate state law." Eleanor nodded slightly at Sophia, recognizing an unexpected ally. "I formally request that today's transcript and recording be preserved as evidence in the judicial conduct complaint I am filing." Judge Whitaker looked around the courtroom, suddenly aware that he had lost control not just of these proceedings, but potentially of his carefully constructed career. His usual allies, the bailiff, the clerk, Even the court reporter, who now typed furiously, capturing every word of his unraveling, were no longer jumping to protect him. "This court is in recess," he announced, his voice hollow. Without waiting for the traditional rising of the attendees, he stood abruptly and strode toward his chambers. As the door closed behind him with a definitive click, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Law students who had been observing court that day for class assignments rushed out, thumbs flying over their phones as they spread the news. Attorneys huddled in small groups, discussing the implications. Court staff exchanged knowing looks. They had witnessed Whitaker's behavior for years, but had never expected to see him challenged so directly. Eleanor remained standing, accepting a bottle of water from her grandson. Though outwardly composed, the confrontation had taken a toll. At 76, her energy wasn't what it once was, and her heart was beating a bit too rapidly for comfort. "Grandma, are you okay?" Marcus asked quietly. "I'm fine, child," she assured him, though she gratefully took his arm for support as they moved toward the exit. "But this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." As they walked down the courthouse steps, a small crowd had already gathered. A local news reporter thrust a microphone toward Eleanor. "Professor Washington, can you tell us what happened in there?" Eleanor paused, considering her words carefully. She had not sought this spotlight, but now that it had found her, she would use it purposefully. "What happened today was a small glimpse into what happens every day in courtrooms across this country," she said. "Justice is not blind when the person administering it sees some people as less deserving of dignity and fair treatment than others." As cameras flashed and more reporters arrived, Eleanor Washington squared her shoulders. Decades ago, she had chosen to fight for justice through education and scholarship rather than high-profile litigation. But sometimes, history placed you exactly where you needed to be, whether you had planned it or not. Behind her, the Jefferson County Courthouse stood imposing and unchanged, just as it had for a century. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The quiet power dynamics that had protected Judge Whitaker for years had been publicly challenged, and the ripples of that challenge were only beginning to spread. By the time Eleanor arrived home that afternoon, her landline was ringing constantly, and her email inbox had exceeded its capacity. Word of the confrontation had spread far beyond the courthouse, amplified by social media and the local news outlets that had initially picked up the story. A shaky cell phone video, captured by a defendant waiting for his case to be called, had already garnered over 50,000 views online. The 15-second clip showed only the tail end of the exchange, Judge Whitaker's face contorting with rage as Eleanor calmly cited judicial ethics violations, but it was enough to capture public attention. "Professor Emeritus Schooling Bias Judge on Constitutional Law," read one headline. "Elderly Black Woman Reveals Secret Identity to Stunned Racist Judge," declared another, more sensationalistic outlet. By evening, national news networks had picked up the story, framing it as "Constitutional Expert versus Biased Judge, Showdown in Traffic Court." Eleanor had expected some attention, but not this tidal wave. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter, Ayanna, a pediatric surgeon in Atlanta. "Mom, you're trending on Twitter. What happened?" Before she could respond, CNN was running a segment featuring legal analysts discussing the implications of the confrontation. MSNBC had booked a panel of experts on judicial accountability. Even Fox News had covered the story, though their framing, "Liberal Professor Disrupts Court Proceedings," took a predictably different angle. Judge Whitaker wasted no time launching a counteroffensive. By 6 o'clock, he had issued an official statement through his attorney. "Today's unfortunate incident has been grossly mischaracterized. What occurred was a simple misunderstanding during routine court proceedings. Mrs. Washington disrupted the court, and a standard contempt procedure was initiated, but quickly dismissed when the situation was clarified. Judge Whitaker has served this community with distinction for 12 years and categorically denies any allegations of bias in his courtroom." The statement's dismissive tone and deliberate use of Mrs. rather than Professor only fanned the flames. Legal blogs began publishing analyses of Whitaker's past rulings, revealing statistical patterns that supported Eleanor's allegations. Court watchers shared their own observations of his behavior. Former defendants came forward with stories of humiliation and harsh treatment in his courtroom. Eleanor's home phone rang again. This time she answered. "Professor Washington? This is Angela Reed from the National Justice Network. We'd like to offer our full support in pursuing accountability in this matter." Before the day was out, Eleanor had received similar calls from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the American Civil Liberties Union, and 3 other civil rights organizations. Her former students organized a rapid response legal team, offering pro bono assistance. Journalists requested interviews, talk shows wanted bookings. The next morning, Eleanor agreed to one carefully selected interview with Nadia Johnson, a respected journalist known for her thorough research and nuanced coverage of legal issues. They sat in Eleanor's book-lined study, where framed photographs chronicled a lifetime dedicated to justice. Eleanor with Thurgood Marshall, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, receiving her Presidential Medal of Freedom. "Professor Washington," Nadia began, "what made you speak up in that courtroom yesterday?" Eleanor's response was measured but powerful. "I spoke up because silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit in that injustice. What I witnessed wasn't just about my grandson or even about me. It was about a pattern of behavior that undermines the very foundation of our legal system, the promise of equal justice under law." She went on to detail the disparities she had documented, placing Judge Whitaker's behavior in the broader context of systemic bias in the justice system. Her words were neither vengeful nor personal, but carried the weight of scholarly authority, combined with moral clarity. "This isn't about one judge," she concluded. "It's about accountability in a system that too often protects its own at the expense of those it's meant to serve." The interview aired that evening and immediately went viral. Eleanor's dignified demeanor and precise legal analysis contrasted sharply with Judge Whitaker's increasingly defensive responses. While she spoke of systemic issues and the need for accountability, he and his supporters made the story personal, attacking her motives and character. A conservative legal foundation issued a statement questioning why a retired professor was loitering in courtrooms and suggesting she had orchestrated the incident for publicity. A local talk radio host wondered aloud if she was playing the race card to gain attention. An anonymous quote from a source close to the judge suggested that perhaps Professor Washington's mental acuity wasn't what it once was, a thinly veiled reference to her age. These attacks backfired spectacularly. Within hours, dozens of Eleanor's former students, now judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, legislators, and academics, began posting testimonials about her brilliance, integrity, and ongoing mental sharpness. The hashtag, Stand With Professor Washington, trended nationally. "Professor Washington could recite the entire Constitution from memory when I studied under her," wrote one federal judge. "Her mind is sharper at 76 than most legal minds at 46. I still consult her textbook weekly in my practice," added a prominent civil rights attorney. "Anyone questioning her competence reveals only their own ignorance." But as public support for Eleanor grew, so did the backlash. Her home address was posted on a right-wing message board. Anonymous callers left threatening messages on her voicemail. Her email was flooded with racist vitriol. The most disturbing development came 3 days after the courtroom confrontation, when Eleanor returned home from a meeting with her newly formed legal team to find her front door defaced with a spray-painted racial slur beneath it, in the same red paint, "Know your place." The police officer who responded seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Probably just kids," he suggested, despite the message's clear targeted nature. Eleanor noted that he took minimal notes and appeared skeptical when she connected the vandalism to the courthouse incident. It wasn't until her grandson arrived with a local news crew that the officer's demeanor changed, suddenly all professional concern for the cameras. That night, as Eleanor tried to sleep in a house now watched by private security hired by her former students, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off or worse coming. We know where your grandson works." Marcus had already faced repercussions at his job at a local bank, where a manager with connections to Judge Whitaker had suddenly found issues with his performance. The subtle pressure being applied was the kind that left no evidence but conveyed a clear message: there would be costs for challenging the status quo. Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker was discovering that his network of protection had limits. The chief judge of the district, initially sympathetic in private, was now distancing himself publicly as the evidence of bias became impossible to ignore. The governor, once a reliable ally, wasn't returning his calls. Even his country club friends were suddenly too busy for their regular golf game. The State Judicial Conduct Commission, which had buried previous complaints, now faced intense public pressure to act. They announced an emergency meeting to discuss the allegations against Judge Whitaker, promising a thorough and impartial investigation. 7 days after the confrontation, Eleanor sat in her living room with Marcus and her team of volunteer attorneys, planning their next steps. The wall of legal texts behind her stood as a reminder of the principles that had guided her life's work. On the coffee table lay printouts of death threats from white supremacist groups, next to a formal complaint they had prepared for the Judicial Conduct Commission. "They're hoping we'll be intimidated," Eleanor told the group, her voice tired but resolute, "that we'll decide it's not worth the trouble and go away quietly." Natasha Green, a former student who now headed a civil rights organization, shook her head. "They clearly don't know you very well, Professor." Eleanor smiled slightly. "No, they don't. And they've never understood that the law, when properly applied, is not about protecting power but about constraining it." She picked up her pen and signed the formal complaint with a steady hand. Tomorrow, they would file it officially, moving from the court of public opinion to the actual mechanisms of judicial accountability. The real battle was just beginning. As the meeting concluded and the attorneys gathered their materials, Marcus helped his grandmother to her feet. "Are you sure about this, Grandma? These people play dirty." Eleanor Washington straightened her spine, the same way she had done before arguing her first case nearly 50 years earlier, when the weight of being the first, or the only, had rested heavily on her shoulders. "Child, I didn't spend my life teaching others to stand up for what's right just to sit down when it gets difficult," she said. "Some fights find you. This one has found me, and I intend to see it through." Have you ever watched someone in power suddenly realize they're not untouchable? Drop a 1 in the comments if you've seen accountability finally catch up to someone who thought they were above the law, and if you're invested in seeing how Eleanor takes on this corrupt judge. Make sure to like and subscribe for the next chapter in this powerful story. The Jefferson County Judicial Center's marble lobby had seen its share of drama over the decades, but the scene unfolding on that Monday morning was unprecedented. Eleanor Washington, flanked by a team of distinguished attorneys, all former students who had dropped everything to support their mentor, strode through the security checkpoint with purpose. News cameras followed their progress, reporters calling questions that went unanswered. Their destination, the Office of Judicial Conduct, where Eleanor would formally file her 60-page complaint against Judge Richard Maxwell Whitaker. The document was the result of 5 straight days of intensive work by her legal team, combining Eleanor's meticulously documented observations with newly surfaced evidence from other sources. "Professor Washington, will Judge Whitaker survive this complaint? Professor, how do you respond to accusations that you're targeting the judge personally? Is this about revenge for the contempt charge?" Eleanor continued walking, head high, ignoring the shouted questions. This wasn't about sound bites or headlines. It was about the serious business of holding a public official accountable for abusing his power. Behind the scenes, Judge Whitaker had assembled his own formidable defense team. Leading the effort was William Harrington, a sharply dressed attorney known for aggressively defending powerful clients against ethics complaints. His specialty was character assassination disguised as legal argument, and his first move demonstrated his approach. "My client categorically denies these baseless allegations and will vigorously defend his spotless reputation," Harrington announced at an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. "Judge Whitaker has been a pillar of this community for decades. This complaint is nothing but a vindictive attack by a retired academic with a personal grudge and a political agenda." The statement was carefully crafted to shift focus from the allegations themselves to Eleanor's motives. It was a strategy that had worked for Harrington in the past: change the subject, attack the accuser, claim persecution. What Harrington didn't know was that Eleanor had anticipated this exact approach. Her complaint included not just her own observations but statements from 17 other individuals, who had documented similar patterns in Whitaker's courtroom. Each account was notarized and supported by court records. The statistical analysis section, compiled by a respected data scientist, showed racial disparities in Whitaker's sentencing that were nearly impossible to attribute to chance. As Eleanor filed the official complaint, Whitaker's team was already preparing their next move, a motion to dismiss based on judicial immunity, the legal doctrine that protects judges from liability for actions taken in their official capacity. It was a broad shield that had protected countless judges from accountability for misconduct. They'll argue that judicial independence requires protecting judges from scrutiny of their decisions, Eleanor explained to her team as they gathered in a conference room afterward. It's a legitimate principle that's been twisted to shelter illegitimate behavior. Jordan Chen, a former student who now specialized in judicial ethics, nodded. The immunity claim is their strongest play. They'll say that questioning his rulings creates a slippery slope that threatens judicial independence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Then we need to make it crystal clear that this isn't about disagreeing with his legal conclusions. It's about discriminatory treatment that violates judicial canons and constitutional protections. The battle lines were drawn, but the terrain kept shifting. That afternoon, Eleanor's team discovered that key records of Whitaker's past rulings, records they had cited in their complaint, had mysteriously disappeared from the court's digital archive. Cases involving minority defendants that had shown particularly stark disparities were suddenly unavailable due to system maintenance. "This is no coincidence," Marcus said, staring at the error message on his laptop. He had taken a leave of absence from his job to help with his grandmother's case after his manager had made it clear that his continued employment would depend on distancing himself from the controversy. Eleanor wasn't surprised. "They're circling the wagons. The system protects itself." What she didn't know was that someone inside that system had anticipated this move. Sophia Martinez, the court clerk who had stood up to Judge Whitaker during the initial confrontation, had been quietly preparing for this moment. For years, she had maintained her own private archive of concerning cases, downloading transcripts and recordings, documenting disparities, saving emails that revealed Whitaker's true attitudes toward minority defendants. When Sophia saw critical records beginning to disappear from the official system, she made her decision. That evening, she arrived at Eleanor's home, a thumb drive clutched in her hand. "Professor Washington," she said when Eleanor opened the door, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have something you need to see." The thumb drive contained what Sophia called her insurance policy, hundreds of documents revealing not just Whitaker's discriminatory patterns but also his efforts to cover them up. Emails to IT staff requesting certain cases be archived, code for removed from public access, notes from chambers showing different treatment planned for defendants based on race, even audio recordings of Whitaker making explicitly racist comments about defendants after they had left his courtroom. "I could lose my job for this," Sophia said, her hands shaking slightly. "But I've watched him destroy too many lives while everyone looked the other way." Eleanor understood the risk Sophia was taking. As a court employee, she had access to these records legitimately, but using them this way could indeed cost her her career and make her a target for the same kind of retaliation Eleanor was already experiencing. "We'll protect your identity as long as possible," Eleanor promised. "But eventually, if this evidence is used, they'll figure out where it came from." Sophia nodded. "I know. I've made my peace with that." The evidence Sophia provided transformed the case from a serious complaint to a potentially career-ending crisis for Judge Whitaker. But it also raised the stakes dramatically for everyone involved. As Eleanor's team incorporated the new evidence into their legal strategy, the pressure on her intensified. Her health, generally excellent for her age, began to show signs of strain. The constant stress, late nights reviewing documents, and emotional weight of the threats against her and her family took their toll. 2 weeks after filing the complaint, while preparing for a preliminary hearing before the Judicial Conduct Commission, Eleanor experienced dizziness and slurred speech during a strategy meeting. Her team rushed her to the hospital where doctors diagnosed a minor stroke. "You need rest," her doctor insisted. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high." This level of stress at your age could lead to something much more serious. From her hospital bed. Eleanor continued working, reviewing documents and dictating instructions to her team. Her daughter Ayanna flew in from Atlanta and was horrified by what she found. "Mom, you have to step back," she pleaded. "Let your team handle this. Your health has to come first," Marcus agreed. "Grandma, Whitaker isn't worth your life. We can find another way to hold him accountable." But Eleanor would not be deterred. This stopped being about Whitaker the moment it became clear how many people he's hurt through the years, she said. "This is about a system that allowed him to weaponize his power against those least able to fight back." She agreed to follow her doctor's orders regarding medication and rest periods, but refused to withdraw from the case. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and nothing short of physical incapacitation would keep her from being there. As news of Eleanor's health scare spread, Judge Whitaker's team saw an opportunity. His attorney released a statement expressing concern for Professor Washington's well-being, while suggesting that the strain of pursuing these unfounded allegations appears to be affecting her health, raising questions about whether this process is in anyone's best interest. The implied message was clear: drop the case for your own good. It was both a threat and an attempt to plant the idea that Eleanor wasn't well enough to be taken seriously. The response came not from Eleanor but from her network. Overnight, a crowdfunding campaign to support her legal expenses raised over $500,000, with donations flowing in from former students, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens moved by her courage. An open letter supporting her complaint was signed by over 100 law professors from across the country, including 2 former deans of Harvard Law School. Most dramatically, 3 other judges from the same district quietly reached out to Eleanor's team. They had witnessed Whitaker's misconduct for years, but had been reluctant to speak out, fearing professional repercussions. Now, with Eleanor leading the way and public attention focused on the issue, they were finally willing to add their testimony to the growing case. As Eleanor recovered in the hospital, Sofia Martinez continued her dangerous double game, working in the courthouse by day, while secretly providing evidence to Eleanor's team by night. She noticed court security officers collecting information on who had visited Judge Whitaker's courtroom on the days Eleanor had been present. She overheard whispered conversations about damage control and containing the situation. Most disturbing was a conversation she wasn't meant to hear between Judge Whitaker and a local police captain in a supposedly empty corridor. "We need to know who she's talking to and what she has. This needs to go away before the hearing." That evening, Sophia made copies of every remaining document she could access. The next morning, she called in sick, packed a bag, and moved temporarily to her sister's home in a neighboring county. The risks were no longer theoretical. They were immediate and personal. The preliminary hearing was just 5 days away. Judge Whitaker's team had filed motion after motion trying to delay it, challenging the commission's jurisdiction, claiming procedural errors, demanding recusals from commission members with any connection to Eleanor. Each motion was denied, increasing Whitaker's desperation. From her hospital room, now guarded 24/7 by volunteers from her church and former students, Eleanor reviewed the final preparations for the hearing. Despite her doctor's warnings, despite her family's fears, despite the escalating threats, her resolve never wavered. "In 1965, I watched people risk their lives for the right to vote," she told Marcus as he helped her review documents. "In 1968, I had crosses burned on my lawn for daring to attend Harvard. This is not the first time standing up for what's right has come with a cost, and the cost was far higher for those who came before me." She closed the file folder and looked out the window at the city spread below, its courthouse dome visible in the distance. "But this may be my last fight, and I intend to make it count." What drives someone to fight for justice despite threats, health risks, and powerful opposition? Comment courage if you admire Eleanor's determination to stand up for what's right despite the personal cost. And subscribe now to see how she faces Judge Whitaker in the upcoming hearing that could change everything. Eleanor was released from the hospital 3 days before the scheduled hearing, against her doctor's advice, but with a compromise. She would work limited hours and allow her team to handle most of the preparation. Her stroke had been minor, but the warning it represented was serious. At 76, she no longer had the physical resilience to match her undiminished mental acuity and determination. Her home no longer felt like the sanctuary it had been for decades. The vandalism had been cleaned away, but the invasion of her personal space lingered like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed off. Security cameras now monitored the perimeter. Her phone number had been changed after the barrage of threatening calls. Her email had been abandoned entirely after being flooded with racist messages and hacking attempts. The personal costs extended beyond Eleanor herself. Marcus had officially lost his job at the bank, the termination carefully documented as performance issues, though the timing made the real reason transparent. Eleanor's daughter, Ayanna, had received threatening calls at her medical practice in Atlanta, causing her to hire additional security. Even Eleanor's 14-year-old granddaughter had been harassed at school by classmates repeating things they'd heard from their parents about her troublemaker grandmother. These attacks were painful, but not unexpected. Eleanor had lived long, enough to know that systems of power didn't relinquish control without a fight, and those who challenged them became targets. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the counterbalancing force of community support that rose to meet these challenges. It began with her church, Mount Zion AME, where Eleanor had been a member for over 40 years. When news of the threats against her spread, Pastor Michael Johnson organized a volunteer security team of church members, many of them military veterans or law enforcement officers, to maintain a 24-hour presence at her home. Professor Washington has stood up for justice her whole life, Pastor Johnson announced from the pulpit. Now it's our turn to stand with her. The church basement became an impromptu headquarters for organizing support. Volunteers coordinated meal deliveries, transportation to medical appointments, and shifts for the security detail. Church members with legal backgrounds assisted Eleanor's core legal team with research and document review. The support extended far beyond the church. Former students created a rapid response network that grew to over 200 attorneys nationwide, all volunteering their expertise. One group focused on the judicial complaint itself, another on documenting the retaliation against Eleanor and her family for potential civil rights litigation. A third team handled media relations, ensuring that Eleanor's message wasn't distorted by Judge Whitaker's spin machine. Most surprisingly, several prominent white attorneys in the community publicly aligned themselves with Eleanor's cause, despite the professional risks. Chief among them was David Reynolds, a partner at the city's most prestigious corporate law firm, who had been Eleanor's student 30 years earlier. Professor Washington taught me that the law is either a tool for justice or a weapon of oppression, depending on whose hands wield it, Reynolds stated in a press conference that shocked his normally conservative colleagues. What she's challenging isn't one judge's bad behavior. It's a system that has allowed that behavior to continue unchecked, despite dozens of complaints over many years. His stance cost him clients and strained relationships with partners at his firm, but it also lent crucial credibility to Eleanor's case in circles that might otherwise have dismissed her concerns. The crowdfunding campaign continued to grow, eventually exceeding $800,000. The funds enabled Eleanor to hire professional security, cover Marcus's lost income, and create a legal defense fund for others who might face retaliation for supporting the complaint. Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker was discovering that his own support network had limitations. While his close allies remained loyal, the broader circle of professional connections began to create distance. Politicians who had happily accepted his campaign, donations now declined his calls. Social invitations dried up. Even his country club companions found excuses to cancel their regular golf games. The night before the hearing, Eleanor sat in her living room surrounded by her closest supporters. Her health had stabilized with rest and medication, but she remained frailer than she wanted to admit. Her daughter had taken a leave of absence from her medical practice to stay with her, sleeping on the couch and monitoring her vital signs with the vigilance only a doctor-daughter could maintain. "Mom, are you sure you're up for this tomorrow?" Ayanna asked, checking Eleanor's blood pressure for the third time that evening. "Jordan and the team can present the case without you physically being there." Eleanor patted her daughter's hand. "Some things you have to face in person, child. This is one of them." Marcus, who had been reviewing documents at the dining table, looked up with concern. "Grandma, Whitaker's people will try to provoke you, to make you appear emotional or unstable. They'll do anything to undermine your credibility. I've been underestimated and provoked by better men than Richard Whitaker for over 50 years, Eleanor replied with a slight smile. They haven't broken me yet. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had faced down Jim Crow as a child, fought for admission to spaces that didn't want her, and built a distinguished career despite obstacles at every turn. The current battle was simply the latest in a lifetime of standing firm against injustice. Across town, in the elegant home that had been in his family for generations, Judge Whitaker was having a very different evening. His wife had taken their children to stay with her parents after reporters began camping outside their house. His attorney, William Harrington, was reviewing last-minute strategy changes as the judge paced nervously. "The commission is compromised," Whitaker insisted, pouring his third scotch of the evening. "Washington has too many former students, too many connections. This was rigged from the start." Harrington sighed. The case had grown far beyond what he had initially anticipated. What should have been a routine defense against a complaint that would normally be quietly dismissed had escalated into a very public referendum on his client's entire judicial career. "Richard, we need to discuss a contingency plan," Harrington said carefully. "If things don't go our way tomorrow—" "Not an option," Whitaker interrupted sharply. "My family has been in this city for 5 generations. My grandfather's name is on the university library. I will not be driven out by some retired academic with a vendetta." What neither man knew was that the most damaging evidence against Whitaker had yet to be revealed. Sophia Martinez, working with Eleanor's team, had uncovered something that went beyond bias in judicial rulings, something that struck at the very foundation of Whitaker's right to sit on the bench at all. The morning of the hearing dawned, clear and cool. News vans lined the street outside the state office building where the Judicial Conduct Commission would meet. Protesters gathered on both sides, supporters of Eleanor with signs demanding equal justice under law and hold corrupt judges accountable, and a smaller but vocal group backing Whitaker, their signs proclaiming, "Stop the witch hunt," and "Respect our courts." Eleanor arrived an hour early, accompanied by her family and legal team. Despite her medical ordeal, she was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, her silver hair perfectly styled, her bearing dignified and composed. She acknowledged the supportive crowd with a small wave, but made no statement as she entered the building. Inside, the hearing room was already filled to capacity. The 7 members of the commission, 4 judges, 2 attorneys, and 1 public member, sat at a raised dais at the front of the room. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes unmistakably high for everyone involved. As Judge Whitaker entered from a side door with his legal team, his eyes briefly met Eleanor's across the room. In that moment of direct contact, something passed between them. Not just the antagonism of opponents in a legal battle, but a mutual recognition of how completely their lives had become entangled in this conflict, and how neither would emerge from it unchanged. The commission chair, Judge Rebecca Lawson, called the hearing to order. "This preliminary hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with a full investigation of the complaint filed by Professor Eleanor Washington against Judge Richard Maxwell Whitaker. Both parties will present opening statements, followed by a summary of evidence. This is not a trial, but an investigative proceeding to determine next steps." As Eleanor rose to make her opening statement, she felt the weight of the moment, not just for herself, or even for Judge Whitaker, but for all those who had faced bias in courtrooms where the scales of justice were secretly weighted. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained strong and clear as she addressed the commission. "I appear before you today not as an aggrieved individual seeking personal vindication, but as a witness to a pattern of conduct that undermines the very foundation of our legal system." In the gallery, Marcus watched his grandmother with a mixture of pride and concern. Whatever happened next, whatever price they had already paid or would yet pay, he knew with absolute certainty that they stood on the right side of this fight. The path forward would not be easy, but they would walk it together, supported by a community that had rallied around the simple, powerful idea that justice should truly be blind. The state office building's main hearing room had never been so crowded. Extra chairs had been brought in, but still, people lined the walls. Court reporters from various news outlets squeezed together at small tables. Representatives from civil rights organizations, law school faculty, and curious attorneys filled every available space. Judge Rebecca Lawson, the commission chair, maintained strict decorum despite the charged atmosphere. "This hearing is not about politics or personalities," she reminded everyone at the outset. "It is about upholding the standards of judicial conduct that our legal system requires." Eleanor's opening statement laid out the case methodically, her decades of teaching constitutional law evident in her precise language and logical structure. She detailed the statistical patterns of disparity in Judge Whitaker's courtroom, the documented incidents of different treatment based on race, and the systemic failures that had allowed these patterns to continue, despite numerous complaints. "The question before this commission," she concluded, "is not whether Judge Whitaker holds biased views in his private thoughts. The question is whether he has allowed such bias to infect his judicial actions, thereby denying equal protection, under law, to those appearing in his courtroom." William Harrington's opening statement for Judge Whitaker took a different approach, focusing on procedural objections and attacks on Eleanor's credibility, rather than addressing the substance of the allegations. "Professor Washington has orchestrated a media circus based on cherry-picked anecdotes and misleading statistics," he argued. "This complaint represents a dangerous attempt to undermine judicial independence by second-guessing discretionary decisions that are rightfully within a judge's authority." He emphasized Whitaker's long service, his family's prominence in the community, and the politically motivated nature of the complaint. Not once did he directly address the documented patterns of disparate treatment. As the evidentiary portion of the hearing began, Eleanor's team presented their case with devastating thoroughness. Jordan Chen walked the commission through the statistical analysis, showing that black defendants in Whitaker's court received sentences averaging 37% longer than white defendants for identical offenses, even when controlling for criminal history and other factors. Natasha Green presented affidavits from dozens of attorneys who had practiced in Whitaker's courtroom, documenting specific instances of disparate treatment. Former defendants testified about being cut off, lectured, and denied the same opportunities to explain their circumstances that white defendants routinely received. Judge Whitaker sat stone-faced throughout these presentations, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but showing no visible reaction to the mounting evidence against him. His confidence appeared intact, as if he still believed his position, and connections would ultimately shield him from consequences. The most dramatic moment came when 3 sitting judges from the same judicial district took the unprecedented step of testifying against a colleague. They described a pattern of behavior they had witnessed over years, but had been reluctant to formally report due to professional courtesy and fear of backlash. Judge Martin Rodriguez, a respected 20-year veteran of the bench, spoke with evident discomfort but firm conviction. "I have observed Judge Whitaker make disparaging comments about minority defendants outside the courtroom. I have seen him apply different standards depending on a defendant's race. I have remained silent about this for too long, prioritizing collegiality over my duty to the integrity of our justice system." By mid-afternoon, Eleanor's team had presented a compelling case that under normal circumstances would have been more than sufficient to advance to a full investigation. But these were not normal circumstances. Judge Whitaker was not merely any judge, but one with deep connections throughout the legal and political establishment. When Whitaker's defense began their presentation, they focused on procedural objections, jurisdictional challenges, and attacks on the methodology of the statistical analysis. They presented character witnesses, primarily white attorneys and community leaders, who attested to Whitaker's fairness and integrity. Their central argument remained that judicial independence required giving judges wide latitude in their courtroom management and sentencing decisions. Any attempt to scrutinize these decisions, they suggested, would create a chilling effect that would undermine the entire justice system. The commission members listened impassively, giving no indication of their leanings. Judge Lawson maintained strict control, allowing both sides equal time and interrupting only when arguments strayed from relevant matters. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor could feel her energy flagging. The stress of the preceding weeks, combined with her recent health issues, made it increasingly difficult to maintain her focus. During a brief recess, Ayanna checked her blood pressure and frowned at the reading. "Mom, you need to rest," she whispered urgently. "Your pressure is too high." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "Not yet. There's something coming that I need to be here for." She was referring to what her team had codenamed the nuclear option, evidence so potentially devastating that they had decided to hold it in reserve, to be used only if it appeared Whitaker might escape accountability despite the overwhelming evidence of bias. When the hearing resumed, Sofia Martinez was called to testify. She entered from a side door, escorted by security officers, a precaution deemed necessary given the high stakes of her testimony. As the court clerk who had worked in Judge Whitaker's courtroom for 5 years, she had direct knowledge of his procedures and private comments. Sofia's testimony began with documentation of the pattern of discrimination she had witnessed, but then took an unexpected turn. "During my duties maintaining court records," she stated, "I discovered irregularities in Judge Whitaker's appointment documentation that concerned me." William Harrington immediately objected. "This is far beyond the scope of the complaint. The complaint concerns alleged bias, not administrative paperwork." Judge Lawson considered for a moment. "The commission will allow this testimony to determine its relevance. Please continue, Ms. Martinez." Sofia took a deep breath. "While organizing historical records, I found Judge Whitaker's original application for the bench. The law degree it listed couldn't be verified through normal channels, so I investigated further." The room fell completely silent. "I discovered that while Judge Whitaker attended Capitol Law School for 2 years, he never completed his degree. The transcript in his application had been altered. He is not, and has never been, a licensed attorney." Gasps echoed through the room. Photographers' cameras clicked rapidly. Judge Whitaker half rose from his seat, his face ashen, before his attorney pulled him back down. "This is absurd," Harrington shouted. "This is character assassination, not evidence. These are unsubstantiated allegations that have nothing to do with the complaint before this commission." Judge Lawson banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will have order." When the room quieted, Eleanor's attorney, Jordan Chen, approached the evidence table. "We have documentation to support Ms. Martinez's testimony, including the original unaltered transcript obtained directly from Capitol Law School's archives, verification from the State Bar that no Richard Maxwell Whitaker has ever been admitted to practice, and evidence of document alteration in the application materials." Harrington was on his feet again. "These materials were not disclosed to the defense prior to this hearing. This is an ambush, a complete violation of procedure. The commission will take a 30-minute recess to review these materials," Judge Lawson announced, her composed demeanor showing its first cracks. "All parties will remain available." As the commissioners filed out, chaos erupted in the hearing room. Reporters rushed to file updates. Attorneys huddled in shocked discussion. Judge Whitaker sat immobile, staring straight ahead, as if in a trance, while his legal team frantically whispered around him. Eleanor remained seated, conserving her energy. The revelation of Whitaker's fraudulent credentials had not been part of her original complaint. It had emerged only through Sofia's diligent investigation, but its implications were staggering. If true, every ruling, every sentence, every judgment Whitaker had issued over 12 years on the bench was potentially invalid. Marcus leaned close to his grandmother. "Did you know about this?" Eleanor nodded slightly. "We confirmed it 3 days ago. It was our contingency if the commission seemed reluctant to act on the bias evidence alone." "So he's not even a lawyer? How is that possible?" "The system trusted him because of his name and connections," Eleanor replied quietly. "No one ever thought to verify his credentials because people like Richard Whitaker aren't subjected to the same scrutiny as the rest of us." When the commission returned after their recess, their demeanor had visibly changed. Judge Lawson's voice was tight with controlled anger as she addressed the room. "In light of the new evidence presented, this commission is recessing the current proceedings regarding judicial bias. We are immediately referring the matter of Judge Whitaker's qualifications to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation of potential criminal fraud. Judge Whitaker is suspended from all judicial duties, effective immediately pending that investigation. William Harrington attempted to object, but Judge Lawson cut him off. This is not subject to debate, counsel. If your client has indeed served as a judge without legal qualifications, this constitutes one of the most serious breaches of public trust this commission has ever encountered. As security officers approached Judge Whitaker, the reality of his situation finally seemed to penetrate his shock. The man who had wielded such power over others now found himself utterly powerless, his carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. In a moment of desperate rage, he turned toward Eleanor. "You did this!" he shouted, his face contorted. "You couldn't let it go. You had to destroy everything." As security moved to restrain him, Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "No, Richard," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "You did this to yourself every time you abused the power entrusted to you. Justice just took longer to arrive than it should have." As Whitaker was escorted from the room, the hearing officially concluded. Outside, a crowd had gathered, having heard about the shocking revelation through news alerts and social media. When Eleanor emerged, supported by Marcus and Ayanna, a spontaneous cheer erupted. Reporters thrust microphones toward her, shouting questions about her reaction to the dramatic turn of events. Eleanor raised a hand for quiet, knowing this moment required careful words. "Today we've seen that our justice system, however imperfect, still has the capacity to correct itself when confronted with clear evidence of wrongdoing," she said. "But we should all be troubled that it took such extraordinary circumstances to address a pattern of discrimination that affected hundreds of lives over many years. The work of creating true equality before the law continues." As Eleanor was helped into a waiting car, exhausted but vindicated, she knew that this victory, while significant, represented just one step in a much longer journey. The system that had elevated and protected Richard Maxwell Whitaker remained largely intact, but a crack had appeared in its facade, a crack that might, with continued pressure, eventually lead to more fundamental change. 1 year had passed since the dramatic hearing that ended Judge Richard Maxwell Whitaker's career and triggered a cascade of reforms in the local judicial system. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood as it always had, its neoclassical columns and dome a symbol of permanence amid change. But inside its marble halls, the transformation was unmistakable. Eleanor Washington sat in the back row of Courtroom 7, observing the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. At 77, she had recovered from her health scare, though she now walked with a cane and had finally conceded to wearing hearing aids. Her presence in this courtroom was not about a specific case, but about witnessing the fruition of a year's hard work. Judge Tanya Williams, recently appointed to fill one of several vacancies created in the aftermath of the Whitaker scandal, presided with a combination of efficiency and empathy that had already earned her the respect of attorneys from all sides of the legal spectrum. She gave each defendant, regardless of race or economic status, the same careful attention and explained her rulings in clear, accessible language. Eleanor smiled as she watched a young public defender present an argument about evidence admissibility. The attorney was Keisha Johnson, one of Eleanor's former students who had volunteered on her legal team during the Whitaker case. Keisha had subsequently left her corporate law position to join the public defender's office, part of a wave of attorneys inspired to recommit themselves to public service. The Whitaker revelation had triggered an earthquake in the local legal community. The initial investigation into his fraudulent credentials had expanded to examine his entire career, uncovering financial improprieties, numerous instances of abuse of power, and even evidence that he had helped bury misconduct complaints against other judges in exchange for similar protection. The Judicial Review Board that had dismissed so many valid complaints was disbanded and reconstituted with stricter ethical guidelines and more diverse membership. 3 other judges with patterns of biased rulings resigned rather than face investigations, using the methodology Eleanor's team had pioneered. Most significantly, the state Supreme Court had adopted new transparency requirements for judicial decisions. Judges now had to document their sentencing rationales more explicitly, and court records were subject to regular statistical analysis to identify potential patterns of bias. These changes, known informally as the Washington Reforms, were being studied by other states considering similar measures. For Richard Maxwell Whitaker himself, the fall had been swift and complete. Charged with fraud for practicing law without a license and falsifying government documents, he had eventually accepted a plea deal that included 3 years probation, substantial fines, and permanent disbarment from any legal profession. His name had been removed from the courthouse donor wall, and his family's once untouchable social status had crumbled. He had sold his historic home and moved to another state, seeking anonymity after a lifetime of prominence. The most personally satisfying outcome for Eleanor, however, was not Whitaker's downfall, but the positive changes his exposure had catalyzed. The Eleanor Washington Legal Clinic had opened 6 months earlier in a renovated storefront near the Isa courthouse, providing free representation to victims of judicial misconduct and systematic discrimination. Funded largely by the remainder of the crowdfunding campaign and staffed by volunteer attorneys, the clinic had already helped dozens of individuals challenge unfair rulings and seek redress for biased treatment. Marcus, inspired by his grandmother's courage and the events he had witnessed, had enrolled in law school. Currently in his first year, he was already distinguishing himself as a thoughtful student with a particular interest in judicial ethics. The bank that had fired him had quietly offered a settlement rather than face a wrongful termination lawsuit, providing funds that helped support his education. Sophia Martinez, whose whistleblowing had proven decisive, had initially faced hostility from colleagues who viewed her as disloyal to the court system. But as the full extent of Whitaker's deception became clear, public opinion shifted in her favor. She received a Whistleblower Protection Award from a national legal ethics organization and was appointed to a newly formed Court Administration Reform Committee, where her insights were helping reshape procedures to prevent similar abuses. As Judge Williams concluded the morning's cases and called a lunch recess, Eleanor prepared to leave. She had another commitment that afternoon, a meeting with state legislators who were considering a bill to establish independent oversight of judicial conduct across the state. "Professor Washington," a voice called as she gathered her things. She looked up to see Judge Williams approaching from the bench. "I hope you found today's proceedings satisfactory," the judge said with, a smile. Eleanor nodded. "More than satisfactory, Your Honor. You're doing excellent work." "I wouldn't be here without you," Judge Williams replied. "None of us would in a very real sense." It was true. Judge Williams had been one of 3 new judges appointed specifically to address the vacancies left in the wake of the scandal. All 3 were highly qualified jurists who might never have had the opportunity under the old system of connections and patronage. As Eleanor made her way slowly out of the courthouse, several attorneys and court staff nodded respectfully or stopped to exchange a few words. Even those who had initially resisted the changes now acknowledged that the reforms had strengthened public confidence in the courts and improved the working environment for everyone. Outside, Eleanor found David Reynolds waiting by his car to drive her to the legislative meeting. The prominent white attorney who had risked his firm's conservative client base to support her had paid a professional price for his stance. Several major clients had indeed withdrawn their business, but he had no regrets. "Ready to educate some legislators?" he asked, helping her into the passenger seat. "As ready as I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, "though I suspect they're more interested in being seen consulting me than actually implementing all these recommendations." "Then we'll just have to be persuasive," David said. "The same way you persuaded me in constitutional law back in 1985. As they drove toward the state capitol, Eleanor reflected on the unexpected journey of the past year. What had begun as a simple act of standing up to an arrogant judge had evolved into a movement for systemic change that was still gaining momentum. The personal costs had been real: her health challenges, the threats, the disruption to her family's lives. But so were the rewards: the clinic helping those who would otherwise have no recourse, the new generation of attorneys recommitting to the ideals that had drawn them to law in the first place, the judges now serving who brought genuine commitment to equal justice. Most profoundly, Eleanor had witnessed the power of community in confronting entrenched injustice. from her church members who had protected her home, to former students who had volunteered their legal expertise, to court employees like Sophia, who had risked their livelihoods to expose corruption, to ordinary citizens who had contributed to the crowdfunding campaign. The victory had been collective rather than individual. 1 year after her confrontation with Judge Whittaker, Eleanor Washington sat in a legislative hearing room, explaining to elected officials how bias operates in judicial systems and how transparency and accountability could help address it. Her voice was strong, her arguments precise, her examples compelling. At 77, she was engaged in perhaps the most impactful work of her long career. The following week, Eleanor attended a ceremony marking the appointment of 3 more new judges, all selected through a reformed process that emphasized qualifications and commitment to equal justice rather than connections. Among them was James Robinson, the young black attorney whose career had been nearly destroyed by Judge Whittaker years earlier. Now he would serve on the same bench, bringing his hard-won insights about fairness and perseverance. As Robinson took the oath of office, Eleanor watched from the audience, tears glistening in her eyes. She thought of her parents, who had fought for civil rights in an era when change seemed impossible, and of all those who had faced Judge Whittaker's bias, without the platform or privilege to challenge it effectively. The ceremony concluded with the new judges greeting well-wishers in the courthouse rotunda. When Judge Robinson reached Eleanor, he embraced her warmly. "I wouldn't be here without you, Professor," he said, echoing Judge Williams' words from days earlier. Eleanor smiled. "You would have found your way eventually, James. I just helped clear some obstacles." "More than some," he replied, "and now it's my turn to ensure the path stays clear for others." Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in the back of Courtroom 3, once Judge Whittaker's domain, now presided over by Judge Martin Rodriguez, who had been one of the 3 judges brave enough to testify against his colleague. She watched as he handled a routine traffic case involving a young black man with the same respect and attention he gave to all defendants. This, she thought, was what justice looked like. Not perfect, still evolving, but striving genuinely toward its ideals. The work would never be truly finished, but each step toward fairness mattered. Each voice raised against injustice made a difference, whether it belonged to a distinguished law professor or to someone without credentials or connections. As Eleanor left the courthouse that day, leaning on her cane but walking with determination, she paused to look up at the words carved above its entrance, "Equal justice under law." For the first time in a long while, they felt not just aspirational, but achievable. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against injustice despite the personal cost? Has someone's courage inspired you to speak up when it would have been easier to stay silent? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if Eleanor's story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that one person can truly make a difference in fighting for justice. Thank you for joining us for this powerful true story. And remember, it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Eleanor Washington's story teaches us that justice requires courage in the face of power. When systems protect those who abuse authority, it often falls to individuals with integrity to challenge the status quo. Eleanor showed that age is no barrier to standing up for what's right, and that expertise combined with moral conviction can topple seemingly untouchable figures. The most powerful lesson is that change rarely comes from working within broken systems. It requires forcing uncomfortable truths into the light. One person's brave stand can inspire others to find their own courage, creating a ripple effect that transforms institutions. Eleanor's case demonstrates how discrimination thrives in shadows, but withers under scrutiny. Her story reminds us that true justice isn't achieved through a single victory, but through persistent effort to reform systems that enable bias. The support Eleanor received proves that community can be a powerful force against intimidation and retaliation. Most importantly, she showed that accountability is possible, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The ultimate lesson? Never underestimate an elderly black woman who knows the law better than you do. Has there been a time when you witnessed discrimination but stayed silent? Or perhaps you stood up like Eleanor despite the risks? Share your experience in the comments below. We all face moments where we must choose between comfortable silence and difficult truth. If Eleanor's courage inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that one voice can make a difference in fighting injustice. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through Eleanor Washington's fight against judicial racism. Remember, the most important step toward justice is often the willingness to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. May we all find a fraction of Eleanor's courage when facing our own moments of truth.